What do you think, everyone? Should we just start going for it now? I think we should. We've got a lot to talk about tonight, so let's go for it. I'll start off. So welcome everybody. We are just thrilled that you're here with us tonight. I think you're really going to enjoy what the presenters are going to be sharing with you tonight. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the First Nations territory of the Namgis First Nations. And my name is Janie Ray, and I'm the founder and CEO of the North Coast Cetacean Society, or as a common name that's easier to pronounce, BC Whales. And what I'd like to start off with is just a little bit of history as to how BC Whales came to be, and then we'll get into the presentations. So it was over 20 years ago, actually, that we purchased a little boat and we traveled up the coast of BC, and we ended up in the Gitga'at First Nations little community of Hartley Bay. And we asked the hereditary chief at that time and the community members if we could build a whale research station within their territory. And not only did they give us permission, but they actually shared with us their own traditional knowledge of whales in the area, and even showed us where a good location would be to build such a station. And then in 2016, we actually built a second station in direct partnership with the Gitga'at First Nation and WWF Canada. And that is the station that a lot of the people that are presenting tonight have spent a lot of time with us at that particular location. And then in the years to follow, we started to develop other very strong partnerships and collaborations with other research scientists around the world, as well as NGOs and other coastal First Nation communities. And the reason for that is because we know and believe in our heart that the only way that we can protect this planet, and in our case, protect whales, is by working together and sharing knowledge with each other, which is the purpose of tonight, is to share with you some of the major projects that we're working on. And with these great presenters tonight that are going to share with you some of the projects that they're working on. And just as a note, as we're speaking, we would love it if you post any questions in the Q&A. And at the end of all the presentations, it'd be great to discuss some of those questions. So please feel free to write them in. And then at the very end, we can start to share them with everybody. And I think with that, Nicole Robinson is going to start off, and I won't say any more. Nicole, you just go ahead and introduce your beautiful self.
Okay, I am going to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we sure can see your screen.
Okay, why did my Zoom thing disappear? I mean, my presentation. Uh-oh. Okay, bear with me.
No problem.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, so I don't know how to, is there a way to pause these screens so it doesn't jump ahead?
I think you'll have complete control on your computer as you go.
Okay. Okay, so Simgiget Siganim Hanana Lagigi Get Gabawalksik Adatani Na Geta Galzap Luam Godu Newel Nisim. Wibu Diwayu Gigatnu Ganhada Depegu Tafgiu Diwawaku Tafgiu Diwal Zogum. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory in Haisla Nation. My name is, I introduced you in my traditional language, Somalia, the language of the Gitga'at people, which is all spoken as well as many Northwest coastal communities in BC. My name is Wibu Neh, which means the sound a killer whale makes when it comes up and blows. My government name is Nicole Robinson, and I'm from Hartley Bay, BC, which is also known as Tafgiu to us. And I also let you know that my clan is Gunhada, the Raven clan from Hartley Bay. I come out of the house of Weehaiwas, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got involved with whale research with Janie and many others on the team you see before us. So my experience history is doing whale research in and around our territory. I also do seasonal and full-time guardian work, and I am currently the community liaison for our Gitga'at Oceans and Lands Department. How do I switch? It won't let me go.
Maybe just if you click on your screen and it might go then.
Oh yeah, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, as I said, I am from Tuckyu, also known as Hartley Bay, BC. It's a Tsimshian nation, which is about 70 miles south of Prince Rupert, and I have spent most of my life in my small community, most of my later life, actually, my adult life. So how I got my start. So in 2013, me and my partner Archie were on our boat at our seaweed camp, and the weather got rough, and Herman Muter was at Whale Point with Janie, where they had established first whale research station in our territory. And Herman invited us in to get out of the weather instead of risking it going home. So we said yes. I finally said yes, and we went to spend the night there. And I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning to the most amazing sound of humpback whale calls. And it like filled the room. And so when I went back home to Hartley Bay, I Googled everything and anything I could find out about Whale Point, about orcas, humpback whales, who's involved, all the names that popped up, researched them, kind of, yeah, did whatever I could. I guess you could call it obsessed over it, and wanted to learn everything and anything. So then later on in 2013, I harassed Janie at the ferry dock in Prince Rupert to go stay at Whale Point. If I could go there for the summer. I even snuck off to Renison Cabin, as you see there. I snuck off in 2013 and kind of went there to stay with my brother and my partner Archie to learn about whales, and even reprogram their whale thing. Actually, I think that was 2014. Yeah, so that was kind of how I started out, was a lot of dedication to learning and everything. And Janie had amazing interns at, like throughout the years, but that year, more specifically, a woman named Kim Lee, I started taking photos of the humpback whale tails and the orcas, and she told me to ID them myself. So I was like, okay, I'll do it. And yeah, so that's where I got my start. And I am forever grateful to Herman and Janie for allowing me that opportunity. So from there, in 2015, I approached our, at the time, CEO about maybe freeing up the Guardian Watchman's time for the summer to work at home, and allowing me and my partner to go stay at the Renison Cabin. And she agreed, but she passed it on to the appropriate people, and they had a meeting about it and they agreed. So me and Archie would spend anywhere from 3 months to 5 months at this cabin. So the first few years was no cell phone service, no internet service, no sat phone, we were extremely isolated from everybody. I think VHF was our main communications, and wouldn't have it any other way. Yeah, so we did land-based and marine-based research. So if there was any sightings in the area, they would call us. We monitored everything that moved but bugs. We did other things for the Gitga'at Ocean Lands Department out there that was required of us. But for us, of course, our main focus was making sure we got all the ideas of all the orcas, and then we shared that data and information with NCCS, also with the DFO Marine Mammal people at the end of our season. So this is a picture of actually Clem 2's Guardian Watchman that stopped by to see us. And I will move on. And there's just a picture of me and my partner Archie. He's doing something with the hydrophone. So that's one of the hydrophone systems that Janie has at Finn Island. And so a lot of the times we would go to Finn Island, and at sometimes we used to go to Whale Point to still help out with them for anything they needed. They'd call on us. So this is when we went to go help with their hydrophone system. So one of the things that I wanted to focus on tonight to talk about was, so being one of the only First Nations researcher in the Northwest Coast, that I'm not saying there isn't others, there might be, but I haven't met anyone yet that does it to what we do. So throughout my years of working with everybody, I started noticing a similarity between the northern resident killer whales and, well, all killer whales and orca in general, and the First Nations. So that's what I kind of wanted to focus on tonight to talk to you about and to share my knowledge and what I've learned along the way and throughout the years. So one of the things I learned was that both specifically northern resident killer whales, but all orca, the northern resident killer whales and First Nations are a matrilineal social structure. They're a matrilineal society. And so us as First Nations, Tsimshian First Nations, we are a matrilineal society. All our names are passed down through our matrilineal lines. Like in our ways, and with the orca, mom is more important. Like she's the most important, grandma's important. They're the birth givers. They're the one that give life. You respect them. You have the utmost respect for them. And that's what I noticed with like the orcas. It's always the mom and grandma are always important. Like they take care of the family. It's like they're the lead of everybody. And that's how it is with us as Tsimshian people. Like we always look up to grandma and the mothers for like everything. Like they're the ones that hold the family together. And they're boss. So that was one of the things I noticed. Like I say here, that orca males, and well, all of them never leave mom. Specifically the males, they never leave mom, and if mom's gone, then there's grandma. I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Janie, but I think the 836 from the A1 clan, they had nobody left. There was no moms, there's no grandmas, there's no females within their pod. There was just 2 males left. And when the one male passed, it wasn't long later, the other male passed. Like, it's almost like they couldn't survive without having a mom or grandma there. Yeah. Like, and then, so that A1 pod is now gone. So that's what I noticed. And like in the First Nation society, like in our ways, like we always take care of other families, and like if like adoption, like taking somebody in, taking care of them, we always take somebody in and we always take care of them. If they don't have mom or grandma there, you take care of them. That's almost like your responsibility is, like to take care of somebody who doesn't have a big family or someone near them. So like when I went home years ago, my grandma's sister took me in to stay in her house, and they took care of me. They fed me. They took very good care of me. And that's kind of like how the orca structure is. So Springer, one of the most very well-known orcas, was orphaned and I think kind of like abandoned and ended up in Puget Sound, and they brought her back up north, and she was introduced back to her cousins, or a cousin family, and they took care of her, and she now has 2 offspring of her own and still swims with her family. And so that's kind of like how First Nations are. You never leave anybody behind. They're always a part of you. So another thing about the orcas and the First Nations is their hunting. So when orcas hunt, so if a trans or resident group, like say we'll get a large spring salmon, they will take back to the family and they share it. So it's kind of like First Nations when we hunt. My partner, every time he harvests foods or anything, or we harvest it together, we'd always share with everybody, like within our family, but we also shared outside of the family. But orcas, they share everything they get, like they just share their foods. And I noticed that's the same as us. So another thing about the orcas, with First Nations people in general is, so with the orcas, they have clans, and you have like the A clan, the B clan, the C clan, the D clan, and they don't speak the same language. None of them speak the same language, but you have like the A clan, where I always say is like the Tsimshian First Nations. We're made up of Tsimshian First Nations of different nations. So you have like Hartley Bay, Gitgat, and then you have Kitkatla, Port Simpson, Kitsilas, Kitasoo. We all speak the same language, but we all have different dialects of our own language. And so that's how orcas are. They all have, like the A clan all speaks the same language, but the A42s have a different dialect from like the A35s or the A23s. So you can tell them apart. So it's like the same thing with the First Nations. We're similar. And then if you expand that, so you have like the A clan, B clan, C clan, which are kind of like the Tsimshian, and the B clan would be like the Haidas, and the C clan would be like the Celtic, where they all don't speak the same language. They all have their own distinct language amongst their own clans, and which, yeah, so they're the same that way too. So I talked to you about with the orcas, they have a thing called the All Clan Gathering. And so when I started hearing about that or learning about the All Clan Gathering, so you have the different clans where it could be like the R's, B's, just saying maybe A's, I's or something, and they're all gathered together. I learned that the males will go off and they will do an acrobat, and it changes every year, but they'll be off together. The males will be off together and their manliness comes out, and the females are off together. And I still don't get how they do this because they don't speak the same language. But the females, I think it's thought that they are choosing, like grandma and moms are choosing a mate for their daughters. And I often joke that that's what all native is, but all native basketball tournament. But I mean, it's also like our feasting. So in our culture, the Tsimshian culture, we had arranged marriages. So that's what it made me think of when they do the All Clan Gathering, and they're trying to find a mate or suitable person for their offspring. The females picking from a choice of males is the same thing as us, where we had arranged marriages where they're picking even from different nations of who they wanted to marry their family members. So my great grandfather, who was a chief, they picked his wife from a neighboring nation of Kitkatla, and it was arranged marriage, and they were married for years and had like 9 kids. I may be wrong on that one, but yeah. So, and my Uncle Billy and his wife, they had 12 children, I believe, and they're arranged marriages, and it worked. So, and it works for the orca. So I'm just gonna also share a few pictures and stuff. Oops. So I was talking about the hunting. So in this picture of the orca, you can see the porpoise underneath. So it's hunting for its foods. And I also shared a picture of a couple of ladies from our village who are coming together to work on fish together. So it's all about like working together and taking care of your people, and orcas do the same thing. And a few more pictures I have of, these are transients. I had to share. And so I was talking about the clans. So this is from the ID catalog, and they'll show the A clan and then the G clan. So I just wanted to point out like what clans are. And when I had the opportunity to be on the boat with John Ford, who's one of the pioneers in whale research and helped fix these catalogs, when I was telling him about what I was noticing about the similarities between First Nations and the orcas, and I asked him about the naming, why they called it clans, and he said that they didn't even know about the relationship to First Nations. That was just a name they came up with, which I thought was very fitting. And so when I talked about how we're like a family structure and we're all like very close, so orcas are very close. They never, grandma's always there, mom's always there. they stay together, they never leave each other. And so in this picture is my grandmother's sister, who is 95, and that's her nieces and nephews and their children. And that was when we had a loss in the family, and they all came together. So my aunt in the picture, grandma aunt Tina, lost a niece, and they all went to go see her. And so that's what we do, and that's what orcas do. Like, they family first. Family is everything. And so here's I talked about the language and everything, and I just wanted to play a little bit of the orca calls. And one of the Janie, can you correct me on who these are?
This is actually a recording from Orca Lab, and you're going to have A's and G's together. So the G's are going to be the pinging sound, and then you're going to have the woo, the A's in the background.
Okay, I'm just gonna cut it off there. So there's two different calls there. So that's like having two First Nations different languages in the same room speaking, and they don't understand what each other's saying, but they still somehow work together. They come together. And here's some more orca and families, and I'll play a little bit of these calls too. And Janie will let you know who they are, because for some reason I don't know. I call them the aliens. So that's just another example of different orca calls. And if you have an ear for it and know, you'll know the difference between all of them. Janie's way better than I am.
Oh, you're pretty good, Nicole.
I just threw these in to show offshores. There, you know, because there's 3 different types of orca in there, and I'm pretty proud of my offshore pictures. Okay. Is that it? Yeah, I think that's it. So one of the other things that I wanted to talk about, though, that I didn't share a slide and put a slide together, was with the similarities between orcas and First Nations, is that, and I was talking to my niece about it today, and I said, you know, it's very odd that it happened, kind of happened in this around the same time in the 1900s, is orcas were hunted and captured, and their offsprings were taken and I call it fish bowls, but they were taken and placed in aquariums. And one of the similarities I thought about was how a lot of our people, where their children were basically ripped from their mother's arms and were taken and placed in residential school, and it just made me think of that, of like how another similarity it was of you know, people coming in and what they did, and how, you know, years of not knowing the damage they were doing, and what years of what the damage was doing to the orcas being in these fish bowls, and you know, the damage of years of what it did to the residential school children and to those that survived. And how I was thinking about like how it still affects them today, and how we still have like Corky still in captivity. And you know, like the A clan that I see every year is Corky's family, and it, you know, it breaks my heart. And yeah, so I just wanted to also share that as one of the similarities that was on my mind and I think about. So I will stop sharing right now.
Oh, Nicole, that was a powerful ending. Wasn't expecting that. You're so right. That's just a beautiful, beautiful way. I think there's probably a few tears right now, but
Yeah.
yes, thank you so much, Nicole. That was really beautiful. I love the connection that you personally have to whales, but I also love when you first brought that to my attention, I was just blown away. I was like, oh my God, that's just incredible. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's beautiful. Aideen, you're next. And Aideen, I think you should tell everybody what time it is where you are right now.
Good evening, everyone, or good morning. It is 3:30 a.m. in Scotland, which is where I am sat right now. But yeah, I couldn't miss the opportunity to get to present our work alongside the team. And thanks to Nicole, that was such a beautiful presentation. I am going to take you down a slightly different track, different tales from my presentation to you this evening. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to presenter mode here. You're seeing my full screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Aideen. I'm in Scotland right now, but I have been working with BC Wales or NCCS since 2017. And yeah, have traveled to BC that first year and just fell in love with the coast and kind of have never looked back since. I've just been constantly trying to find, I guess, new projects and ways of continuing the work with NCCS. And that's what I was hoping to present this evening, is some of the results from our recent blow sampling work that we carried out. Well, I say recent, it was 2019, but with COVID and all of that, it's a while back now. So that was my master's work here at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And the results of that have essentially created the blueprint for a larger project that we're now in the process of developing. So I'll touch on that as well this evening. But I always like to open with this picture because this is probably one of my favorite photographs of a humpback taking a breath during a blow sampling flight. So I'll talk more about that in just a sec. In fact, right now. So essentially, what we were trying to do is we were asking a couple of questions, but the main thing was, can we collect blow samples? So when a humpback whale, so as opposed to talking about orca the way Nicole did so beautifully just now, my presentation focuses mainly on humpbacks, but also a little bit on fin whales. We wanted to figure out if we could use a drone to collect a blow sample from these baleen whales, and if that blow sample is a decent enough sample for DNA from these whales in order to ask a whole range of different questions. And the main questions that we were hoping to ask, without knowing whether or not we would even be able to get any DNA out of these blow samples at all, let alone freeze them for long enough when you're in such a remote place, and then get them halfway around the world to a lab where we would then try to see if there was DNA that we could use in these samples. But kind of the four main goals with these blow samples was to see if we could use it as a way to genotype or genetic fingerprint these whales. So when we're collecting fluke photographs, for example, for photo identification, we have this track record of who these whales are, who they're socializing with, what part of the coast they're visiting, what with humpbacks, for example, what breeding grounds they go to. So could we begin to overlay a genetic fingerprint with these photo IDs? Secondly, could we look at maternally inherited DNA, so these matrilines, an idea of looking at matrilineal structures within humpback whales? And also, could we use these blow samples to ask the question of who the males are? When it comes to humpback whales, we've documented over the years who the mothers are, as the mothers return to BC, to their feeding ground, with their calves in tow. That first year of the calf's life, it stays with its mum. And essentially, that's the way that we know that that's the female, that's the mum. But we never really had confirmation of who the males are within this population. So could we use these blow samples to find out who the dads are, who the males are? And then could we use these blow samples to look at relatedness amongst humpback whales. So if we know family structure, for example, especially looking like what you've just heard from Nicole about the orca and these tight family groups, is trying to understand a little bit more about what exists, what relatedness might exist amongst these humpback whales. So we used a drone, like I said, we had jerry-rigged this kind of DIY system to attach Petri dishes to the drone. We're upscaling now to having 3D printed attachments, and it's all getting very fancy, but this worked perfectly well in 2019 for us. And you can just see the droplets of whale snot or whale blow on these Petri dishes, and that is essentially what holds all of these answers within it. So just to share with you what a blow sampling flight looks like, what you're seeing now is, or what I hope you're seeing now, is a video playing what the drone sees when the drone flies over a whale, bearing in mind that all of this work is done under our research permit. And so, you know, we have certain protocols in place to make sure that everything is above board and done properly through the permit. So what you're seeing is a humpback whale. And the benefits of, in some sense, working with this technology with drones is that you get a bird's eye view of the whale. So what you're seeing right now is the whale under the surface of the water. As it comes up, takes a breath, swoop down and through it with the drone. But often when these whales are traveling just beneath the surface of the water, you can't see them with the naked eye. So the advantage with working with a drone is that you have this constant visual. As long as they're close enough to the surface of the water, you have a constant visual to be able to track them enough to capture a few breaths for this sample. And often a flight, you saw here, this was a flight of 2 breaths, takes a couple of minutes, and then you can return the drone back to ideally land. We do a lot of this work from land, but also from our boat at times. So some of the main results from this blow sampling work, and like I said, it was 2019, was the field season for the start of this project. We were able to collect 88 blow samples in total, which was a big success after a whole host of different field season challenges that are inevitable when you work in a remote place, such as out at the Finn Island Research Station. But it was a great success in the end. We were trying to figure out whether or not blow sampling using a drone was going to have an impact on the whales. Every project that we approach is in an attempt to minimize impact on whales, but also to better understand them. So the reason that the thought process behind adopting a drone is a blow sample with a drone less stressful for a whale than, for example, some more commonly adopted techniques such as biopsy sampling, where you have to get quite close with a vessel, you're making direct contact with a whale, but you do get a really good DNA sample from these biopsy samples. So it was trying to ask this question of what's the balance? How much can we get out of these blow samples, but are we still having less of an impact on them? So out of over 100 blow sampling flights, the majority of those, 86% of those, we saw no behavioral response at all. So the way that we measured invasiveness was to look for any kind of behavioral response in these flights. So that's pretty promising. The majority of them, no response was detected. And again, pretty successful. Almost 90% of the samples that we collected, we were able to determine the sex of that whale. And interestingly, we did find that there was a direct 1-to-1 ratio of males to females, which is for humpback whales what you expect to find on a feeding ground, such as what BC is for these whales. So you have male to female 1-to-1 ratio. And then this idea of genetic fingerprinting, again, there was quite a promising success with this. So the genetic markers that we targeted, we tried to sequence 10 of these markers, and on average in each sample, 7.5 of these worked. And really the take-home message from this is the studies that came previous to us with collaborators of ours, the teams that we worked with to try to build these protocols, they were able to sequence about 2 markers in total, and we were able to jump up to 7.5. So it's this, and Janie touched on it, it's this idea of collaborating with different teams and different fields of expertise in order to consistently improve and better our ability to understand and research these whales. And then finally, taking a look at some of the different, essentially trying to understand what the quality of these samples is and what makes a good blow sample. As you probably would expect, the more breaths that you can sample, the better the sample is going to be. But again, it's about walking this line between the impact that you have on whales and how good of a sample you can collect. So trying to find that balance is one of the key challenges in some sense of this project. So in terms of the matrilines, and it's mitochondrial DNA, is maternally inherited DNA that we were able to sequence from these blow samples. And essentially from this slide, I just take a look at that big pie chart on the left-hand side. What this shows you is the frequencies of these mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. And essentially you can see that there's a majority of an A- and an A+ haplotype. And then if you can see the map on the right-hand side, and there's a pie chart that I have just put inside in a little red box. This is a figure from a huge North Pacific humpback whale study. So this study was looking at the entire North Pacific humpback whale population, both in terms of photo ID, but also biopsy sampling. And if you look at that pie chart in the red box, the ratios or the frequencies of the haplotypes are very similar to what we were able to find with these blow samples. So again, just a very promising indication that from a relatively small number of samples in comparison to this huge splash study that was done, we're still able to get very representative results. So very promising to use this type of sampling in a much smaller area for larger projects going forward. So that was going out there into the field in 2019 and not really knowing if we would even be able to find any DNA, to be able to at the end of the project see that not only can we find DNA, but we're actually finding the same patterns as what's being found with much larger studies and using a totally different sampling technique. That was, yeah, a huge success and really exciting to begin taking this a little bit further forward. So what can you do with all of this genetic information? We have all of these different pieces. We have the gender, we have the mitochondrial haplotypes, we have these genetic markers, these 7.5 genetic markers per sample. And what can you do with that? So we had just run this big social network study. So essentially when you think about something like, for example, social media and how we're all interconnected with each other in some sense online, we took a similar approach to trying to understand the humpback whale population using northern BC, using the Kitimat fjord system. And because humpback whales are they're accepted as having what is called a fission-fusion society. So essentially humpbacks will come together and break apart in not very stable social bonds, such as, for example, what you see with the orca, like Nicole spoke about just before me. But in fact, we found evidence of these humpbacks spending quite long periods of time with each other. So for example, there's this one pair of whales that we've documented socializing with each other for up to 12 years now. Every single year they're seen together. And the 12-year limit is only just because that's what our study period was. So who knows how long these whales are hanging out with each other, our friends, are perhaps relatives. We didn't know at this point. So with this social network study, we were able to find that they actually cluster into these communities. And the figure here, the diagram, the colors are representative of what those communities are. And in particular in this network on the left-hand side, you can see that those colors kind of cluster together, indicating that these communities are bonded with each other socially more so than between different communities, between different colors. And one of the driving factors of these communities is the way that they feed. So bubble net feeding whales, the act of bubble net feeding is a big driver for these communities. So where do the blow samples come into this? Well, what we did was we calculated pairwise relatedness. So between each pair of humpback whales, we were able to use the genetic fingerprint to look at what level of relatedness they have between each other, whether or not they're brothers and sisters, parent offspring, or just more distantly related to each other. And we related that to their feeding strategy that we used. And bearing in mind that this is a first time study for us as a small data set in comparison to, for example, the social network study that we did, it was much, much bigger in scale. But we were able to find a higher level of relatedness amongst humpback whales that bubble net feed than those that don't. So even though it's a very few number of samples, it looks like that humpback whales that use the bubble net feeding technique seem to have higher levels of relatedness amongst each other. So that in itself is just reason to explore this much further. So naturally, the question, as always the case in a scientist's mind, is, okay, we've done that. So what comes next? What's the next project? What's the next question that we're going to ask? And one of the primary ones that we've been pondering for a long time, and Janie much longer than I have been, is the knowledge of these humpback whale hotspots up and down the coast of BC. We don't know why these hotspots exist. There's hotspots of whales in particular areas at particular times of year. But then in areas that are very similar, there's very infrequently they're visited by humpback whales. So how can we characterize what these humpback hotspots are? What are they driven by? And can we use genetic information to better understand what these hotspots are consisting of? And then in parallel to that, something that will tie in quite nicely to the hydrophone network, which will be touched on in much more detail later on in this presentation, not by myself, but I think both by Ben and Janie, is the idea of having a coast-wide network of hydrophone stations, and those hydrophone stations becoming a more general biomonitoring station. So this idea that not only are we going to collect acoustic data at these stations, but we're also hoping to collect environmental DNA, which I'll speak about in just a sec, some oceanographic data, and use that as a more general and holistic approach to monitoring the coast of BC in terms of whale habitat use, but also much more generally in terms of some of the other species that use this coast. So what ways are we going to do this? We're going to continue blow sampling, both for the hotspots and other biological questions that we're asking. We're going to collect environmental DNA, which I'll explain in 2 seconds. And then we're going to use some satellite remote sensing data that you can access freely online, but also just do some general oceanographic sampling ourselves using CTDs. So environmental DNA, very, very briefly, I won't go into too much detail with it, but the premise of it essentially is that you have DNA suspended in seawater. All of the creatures that live in that water will leave a trace of DNA. So if you collect some water and you pass it through a specialized filter, all of the DNA gets captured in the filter. And if you freeze the filter to preserve the DNA and get it to a lab, in that lab then we'll be able to extract and sequence the DNA found within that filter. And what you can essentially get out of that is huge amounts of information and huge strings of essentially these 4 letters, A, T, G, and C. And the combination of this genetic code can tell you a whole host of different things. And in particular, it tells you what species are present in the sample that you've collected. So not only will that help us characterize these whale hotspots in relation to whales present, whale prey present, but it can also become the basis for much more long-term biodiversity monitoring and trying to monitor changes in biodiversity levels in relation to different threats that exist, such as, for example, climate change in the long run. And then also looking at things like the distribution of different species on the coast of BC and how they might relate to each other. So very briefly, this is what, for example, an eDNA data set can look like. It's pretty impressive when you see that just from a simple, seawater sampling, this study generates a huge amount of information on all of the different species that are present. So you've got mulla, the sunfish here, you've got whales present in this data set, you've got sharks, you've got fish, and all of that just from simply sequencing the DNA found within water. So that is some of the approaches that we're hoping to apply in this project going forward. And then my take-home message, my last slide really is that all of these different techniques that I've spoken about, but also all of the different research projects that we have ongoing within BC Wales or NCCS, they're all puzzle pieces trying to piece together a much bigger picture. And really the thing that I tried to keep in mind when I'm approaching the research is that it really is an interconnected system of different species, different even geographical features, different people and communities, and how interconnected that is. The interconnectedness of that is important. And if you can apply, I think, that concept to a research project, it can just give you a more holistic and big picture overview of perhaps what's important, what are the important questions to ask, and how can they be used for the benefit of, you know, conservation and the protection of these species on the coast. So with that, I'm sure I've gone over my time, but I will wrap up and pass back to Janie, who will introduce our next speaker, Grace. Thank you.
Thanks, Aideen. I love how you make genetics so interesting. You really do, though. Every time I listen to you, I'm just blown away by it. I think it's just such important work that you're doing. We're thinking that maybe we should take a 2 to 3 minute break, just in case anybody wants to grab a tea or a coffee or whatever somebody needs to do. But how about, what should we do, team? 3 minutes, 5 minutes?
Let's do 3 minutes. Sounds great.
3 minutes. All right, 3 minute break, and we'll all be right back.
Sounds good.
You're Cohen eating in the background there. Eating too fast, I think. All right. Grace, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Hopefully everybody's back, but we can just make a start either way. All right, so I'll just share my screen here and I'll be right with you. Okay, can you see that all right? Great. Okay, so hi everybody. My name's Grace. I've been working with NCCS or BC Whales since 2019, and we'll be returning this next season, which I'm really looking forward to. Today I'll be highlighting some of our new research projects that explore how drones can be used to assess conservation threats and to gain new perspectives on group behaviors. But before I get into the content of this presentation, I wanted to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that I am speaking today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. I'll also be sharing some drone footage and imagery in this presentation, and they were all obtained under a specialized research permit. So before we move forward, I also wanted to remind everyone of the laws surrounding drone flights and marine mammals. The easiest thing to remember is that it's effectively illegal to fly over marine mammals in Canada without a specialized permit. But for a full list of laws and regulations, please visit the Transport Canada website. Okay. Into the content. So in our recent past, whales were industrially viewed as a commodity, and they suffered from intense hunting around the world. That left many populations at extreme risk of extinction, and it forced an international moratorium on commercial whaling to secure a future for whales on this planet. But this moratorium was enacted within one generational step of many of the species that we see along the coast of British Columbia today. And so many of our populations of whales are still recovering from the days of whaling, and they must now also face the unintended consequences of everyday human activity and development, some of which are listed here. So within our own research area in Gitga'at territory, we are primarily focused on monitoring humpback and fin whales, and this includes the monitoring of the threats that they face. As we began to have drones in the air at the beginning of Aideen's master's project in 2019, we quickly realized from the flight footage that we were obtaining that there's an incredible opportunity to expand the ways we're using this aerial technology to include assessments of some of the threats that whales are facing in British Columbia today. So the first is the risk of being hit by a vessel. And until recently, we did not realize how common it is for whales to be invisible from a vessel, but still present just below the surface, which is what you can see with this fin whale swimming here. So for a long time, it appeared as though when a whale was diving, that they were actually going quite deep into the water column or sinking out of view and away from the risk of a collision. But as soon as we got drones in the air, we quickly realized that this is not always the case. So we're frequently observing this behavior of resting travel, where these whales can be traveling great distances at quite slow speeds just below the surface of the water. And so this makes them completely invisible if you are looking from a side-on or lateral perspective, but completely vulnerable to being hit by a ship, and especially if a ship were to come on scene without already knowing about a whale's presence. We were also very quickly reminded how easy it could be for a whale to become entangled in discarded or lost marine debris, active fishing gear, or really any other synthetic material that could be out there in the ocean. So whales, and especially humpback whales that we're seeing in our research area, are routinely and purposefully seeking out patches of kelp that you can see here with this humpback and rolling in it. So the risk of becoming entangled is now not only dependent on just the chance of running into synthetic material, but it might actually be heightened if these whales are mistaking ropes and netting for a patch of kelp that they've actively sought out. So after reviewing all the footage that was obtained in 2019, we decided to develop a study and methods for the long-term monitoring of entanglement and ship strike. We specifically decided to investigate the scarring on the bodies of live individuals to lend us some insight into how pervasive threats of ship strike and entanglement are to members of our seasonally resident humpback and fin whale populations. So as was mentioned a little bit previously, the characteristics and markings that an individual whale may accumulate over the course of its life really tell a story, and that can allow us to look back in time and to start to piece together portions of what each whale may have encountered and survived throughout its life. The uniqueness of scars, markings, and pigmentation patterns are also what allow us to differentiate individuals and can shed light on the interactions that are happening between whales and other members of the same populations, between whales and other species, or between whales and humans or human-made products like ropes and netting. We can't always tell exactly how each scar originated, but there are certain placements and characteristics of scars that we can look for to help us piece the whole story together. And we're doing this through scar analysis. So injuries sustained by ship strike events are generally associated with blunt force trauma or sequential lesions left behind on surviving individuals, some of which you can see here on the screen. The severity of an injury or the likelihood that it would result in the mortality of an individual whale is related to the speed and the size of the ship involved in the collision. In general, ship strike events with vessels that are going faster than 7 knots tend to be more likely to be lethal, but really any interaction between a vessel and a whale could have the potential to be lethal for both parties, for both human and whale, and especially if those ships are longer than 20 meters in length, which is what you can see here with this fin whale draped across the bow of that container ship. Unfortunately, occasionally, these large container ships are actually arriving to port with whales draped like this, being completely unaware that they're present or that they've struck a whale. For entanglement, the scarring is most often concentrated around one or more of the fluke and peduncle region, the jaws, and the pectoral flippers. And the video that you saw earlier on in the presentation with that humpback whale swimming through kelp may have already given you a good understanding for how these whales are becoming entangled in synthetic material, but I quickly also wanted to highlight how this may be happening beneath the surface and away from human eyes. So many fisheries rely on pots and traps that are laid along the seafloor and are connected to each other with ground lines and connected to the surface with a vertical line attached to a buoy. And so the ground lines and the vertical lines of these fixed line fisheries also pose a great threat to whales all along the coast, because if a whale were to swim through any of these lines, there is a chance that it could become seriously entangled. The reason that we are focusing our efforts on scar analysis is because mortality rates relating to or resulting from ship strike and entanglement are consistently underestimated. And that's largely due to the rarity of recovering bodies of marine mammals that have died at sea. So most often what happens when a whale dies is they actually sink to the bottom of the ocean. And that's actually a great thing for marine ecosystems and in the fight against climate change, because whales are massive stores of carbon. And so when they sink, they actually are either recirculating that carbon to other marine organisms, or it's being sequestered directly into the sea floor. But that means that investigating mortality on its own is insufficient if we're trying to figure out how pervasive the threats of ship strike and entanglement are to baleen whales. And so greater efforts are needed to document these effects on live individuals. And that's what we're aiming to do with our scar analysis. But historically, scar analysis studies have relied on the use of digital cameras and would focus on capturing the terminal dive or the fluking sequence of whales as they head to the depths of the ocean. The problem with only using DSLR or other cameras is that they give you a lateral viewpoint of the whale, but not every surface behavior for every species is the same. So fin whales are a great example for where this might fall a bit short because they don't actually raise their flukes on terminal dives. So what we see here with this fin whale is quite typical for the behaviors that we're observing at the surface and for how much of that body is actually available for us to see from that lateral or side-on viewpoint. So that essentially means that any previous study that did use that as a strategy for data collection was leaving the main sections that were vulnerable to entanglement, like the jaws, pectoral flippers, and flukes, completely invisible to analysis. And it basically led to the belief that they were not considerably threatened by entanglement. But thankfully, from some more recent studies that have incorporated drones, we know that they are vulnerable and that relying only on digital cameras led to the underrepresentation of this threat. So adding the drone really allows us to analyze the whole body of whales, regardless of their surface behavior. And so just as an example here, we have a fin whale image that was captured with the drone. And at the same time that this was being obtained, from a side-on viewpoint, we were able to obtain this image here. And as you can see, there is a considerable difference in the amount of body that is visible and therefore available for identifying and analyzing any scars that may be present. But that's not to say that drones are just the end-all be-all for scar detection and classification. We truly do need to be looking from both perspectives, from an aerial and a side-on perspective, to be getting that full picture about what's truly going on. So as an example here, we have a drone image of a mother and calf from this last season. But the drone image itself did not actually reveal the presence of the scar that is just behind the dorsal fin. So to truly get that full picture, we need to be looking from both perspectives, and that's going to give us a much better idea about what's going on and make us less likely to miss a critical scar in our analyses. So the ultimate goal and direction for this project is the creation of a scarring catalog, much like the individual identification catalogs that exist globally around the world for identifying whales. And that will help us to develop a baseline understanding for how many of the whales in our research area have already been involved in an entanglement or ship strike event. And moving into the future and with continued monitoring will allow us to document any newly acquired scars and to figure out how often entanglement and ship strike events are truly occurring along our coast. Okay, so before we move into using drones to analyze some group behaviors, I also wanted to mention that if you ever do see a whale that you believe may be entangled or otherwise in distress, it is so incredibly important that you do not try to intervene yourself. You will be placing yourself and that whale at a much greater risk. And the best course of action would be to contact the Department of Fisheries and Oceans through their marine mammal incident reporting line, which is on the screen here and easily findable if you look up online. Okay, so moving on to some group behaviors from a drone's perspective. This will be focusing on bubble net feeding. So bubble net feeding is a incredibly unique and specialized feeding strategy used by humpback whales only in specific parts of the world and by only certain individuals within those populations. So from our identification work over the last 20 years, as Janie's been working up there, we know that the same 9 individuals have been practicing this behavior together for close to 16 years. And we have observed other humpback whales trying to join this group, and some have been accepted, but others have not. So it's incredibly interesting for us to be looking into this feeding technique and sorting out as much as we can about it with this new perspective. So during bubble net feeding events, what happens is humpback whales will be trapping schools of fish. This will be herring most often in the Northeast Pacific where we are. And through the combination of bubble blowing and specialized vocalizations, they will be feeding on that fish that they trap. So in a typical bubble net feeding scenario, groups of about 2 to 15 individual whales will descend together into the water column, usually to a depth of about 20 meters, and they'll be organizing themselves into 2 main roles, and these are callers and bubble blowers. So it's currently believed that callers will remain below a school of fish and vocalize their bubble net feeding call, which Ben will be sharing with you in a little while. And the remaining members of the group will be swimming together in a tightening spiral, blowing bubbles out of their blowhole to create that actual bubble net. Some experimental studies have actually looked into the response of herring to see how they respond to being approached by humpbacks and trapped in that bubble net. And they found that they're actually extremely unlikely to try to leave that net, even in the presence of a simulated predator. And other studies have explored how the acoustic propagation of those feeding calls actually impact the surrounding waters. And they found that it's the loudest within the actual bubble net itself. And so that is believed to promote schooling behavior further into that bubble net and prevent those prey fish from leaving. And so then after all that's said and done, these whales will come together and lunge through the center of the bubble net and engulf that trapped fish. But to the best of our knowledge, every study that has investigated the individual roles of humpbacks within a bubble net feeding group have relied on the use of D-tags, which are sound and movement recording devices or data loggers that are suction cupped to the bodies of animals. So similar to what Aideen was saying about how we're trying to reduce our impact and not relying on biopsy sampling, we're taking the same approach with trying to learn about bubble net feeding humpbacks and piecing together those behaviors. So there still remains this knowledge gap with how what we see visually at the surface during these feeding events relates to the underwater role partitioning and group organization to divide each whale into a role during these feeds. And from our many years documenting and studying this feeding in Git-Gat territory and throughout the Great Bear Rainforest, we've noticed that there's very rarely any vocalizations between feeding events while those whales are still at the surface. And when they do occur, they tend to be inconsistent in their call type or occurrence. So we believe that there may be another way that these whales are organizing themselves and partitioning those roles, and that maybe those roles are changing between each feeding attempt. So after reviewing drone videos that were captured during flights over bubble net feeding humpbacks, we discovered that analyzing a complete aerial view of these large feeding groups provides quite a unique perspective on that within group behavior. So we hope to be exploring how these surface behaviors may indicate the roles of each individual, and we're going to be hopefully doing this through consideration of changes to dive order, changes in relative positions within feeding groups as they're lunging, which you can see in this image here in front of the Finn Island station, as well as changes to pre-dive formations, which you can see in these 2 drone shots. There's a few different formations we're starting to recognize, and it will be incredibly fascinating as we move into this next season to see if these are consistent and if there's any other changes that we can pair up with those. So that's all from me, and I'll be passing the torch now back to Janie and to Ben.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Grace. You explained that so well. You really did. That was great. And it makes me, and I'm sure I just can't wait to get up there and start working with that drone and those bubble net feeding events, because it really is a really exciting project, I think, for this season. Yeah, combined with everything else. And with that, Ben Hendricks, take it away.
Thank you, Janie. Let me see. There we go. Everyone is seeing the right thing?
Yes.
Thumbs
Good.
up. Sounds good. Hello, everybody. I'm Ben Hendricks, and I hope I will find most of you still awake. I think I will take you down a little bit of a technical rabbit hole with my talk, which is about how we use sound to learn about whales and to hopefully aid conservation efforts along the coast. And specifically, what I'll be talking about is a coastwide acoustic monitoring project for whales that is established with Janie and the North Coast Cetacean Society. Specifically, that project is called BC Coastwide Hydrophone Network. And what that does is it's an umbrella organization to help streamlining the acoustic data collection and the analysis for coastal communities along the west coast of Canada. So on the map here, you see the individual symbols are acoustic monitoring sites. And those are all independent partners participating in the project, First Nation communities and NGOs. And all of them are interested in how healthy is my ocean environment and what is going on, what are the whales doing, and how much noise do we get in our environment, and how does it affect the healthiness of the species that live within there. And each of these acoustic monitoring sites practically contain three elements to get the acoustic data out of the water. The first element is the hydrophone, or the underwater microphone, that you actually can't see on this picture. It's hidden in this yellow sock. And then this whole device goes underwater and records, hopefully continuously, everything that makes sound underwater. The second component is an electrical station that lives on land close to the hydrophone and supplies the whole system with everything it needs to stay alive. So electricity, but it also tells the hydrophone the time of the day and all this information. And it takes out the data that the hydrophone produces. And then the third component of the monitoring setup is a computer hub somewhere close by where all the data is stored and logged, and where we do the analysis of that acoustic data. And in BC, as most of you will know, we have a ton of different whales being active all around the coast. And the three that we are currently focusing mostly on are orca, humpback whales, and fin whales. And I think at this point, you may have heard it in the previous talks before a little bit, but it's really important to highlight how important sound is to whales. So whales do have eyes, but underwater eyesight is a really limited sensor device for critical life functions, as is smell, by the way. So whales really, really rely on sound, and they carry out all their life function with sound. They find food with sound, as Grace just explained with the bubble net feeding technique. They find mates with sound. They compete with each other using sound. They're very social animals, with what we learned from the great talk from Nicole, and they're using sound to express themselves and to exchange themselves. So this is great for us as scientists because we can listen to that sound and learn ourselves. And this is what happens. So if the sound comes out of the water, someone like Janie's ear here may listen to something like this. And this can go on and on for a long time. What it actually is a group of humpback whales performing bubble net feeding. So this is bubble net feeding calls that do something to the fish, potentially stunning them to make them easier prey for the humpback whales. And most people like to listen to this, which is very amazing. I'm more of a physicist and programmer. So what I like to do is I like to put a computer behind the sound. And for a computer, the sound looks like this. It's a visualization of this bubble net feeding call you just heard. And what it practically is, it's an energy representation of the sound in the ocean. And each of these bright little lines is an individual call. And the beautiful thing about having a computer sitting and listening to that hydrophone is you can program it to detect each of these calls. And then in the next step, you can teach the computer to classify them, to not just detect it as an interesting sound, but to say this is a humpback whale, and it is actually a humpback whale bubble net feeding call. And the reason why we can do it is because each sound in the ocean has their own acoustic fingerprint. I love having Aideen talking about the genetic fingerprint. So now you have the acoustic fingerprint. Everything that makes a sound can be trained to a computer to be recognized as such, whether it's an orca or a humpback whale or even a specific call type they use. And that is what eventually, when we use machine learning, the technique that we need to use for that, we can characterize all these calls, and at a single site, we detect about 20,000 of these bubble net feeding calls as an example per year. And just the number gives us a great amount of information to learn something, for example, about when they're active in an area. So that plot is simply counting the calls for each month for the bubble net feeding technique they're using. And the dark bars indicate when they're doing during the night, and the light bars indicate when they're bubble net feeding during the day. So just looking at this, we see that they're most active during the summer, most active in August specifically, and that they're feeding more often during the day than they do during the night. And then we can use the sound to localize these whales. For that, we need more than one hydrophone, at least 3, and all of these hydrophones need to detect these calls at the same time. And when they do, we can pinpoint the calls on a map. So that's the map that is shown here for these same bubble net feeding calls. And what we learn is, where do these whales like to perform these life functions? Where do they like to feed? And you immediately see they like being close to the shoreline. They don't like to be in the center of this particular channel. And you can also see that they don't like each spot along the shoreline in the same way. They seem to have little hotspots where they prefer to feed. So this is all great information already. And then we can go further. And if you look at this little video, you can see a 5-day time-lapse video of fin whales, in this case, being acoustically active. And you recognize you're not looking at individual localized calls anymore, but now you see a whale track or a sonic trail or whatever you want to call it. So what we do with this is we're not only looking at the individual localizations, but we cluster them. So we put them in a group saying this is either an individual whale or it's a group of whales. And then when we translate this into an analysis, out comes the spaghetti plot on the bottom here, which is tracks from fin whales during the day again and during the night. And that type of information provides interesting knowledge about how whales use the area and when and where they are vulnerable. And then finally, we archive all that. And I put a specific symbol for that. It's very important to me to highlight this, the point of archiving this data, because you have to recognize that along the coast, we collect hundreds of terabytes of acoustic data each year. And the computer makes it possible to crunch that down to a few gigabytes of critical information that we like to maintain and that we like to share with people. And now you can have a few gigabytes, you can put it up on a website, you can distribute it, and all this, because it is done with a machine, it can happen in close to real time, which means when a whale is active, we can have all this information delivered to the internet. And one of the things we like to do with that information when it's available is to share it. And this is just a screenshot, and I will briefly go out of my presentation to actually demonstrate what we like to do. So this, you should see now my internet browser. Thumbs up if that's happening. Good. So this now is not a plot anymore or a report, but it's an interactive figure. So I can move my cursor over one of these bubbles and it gives me information. And what this plot is actually showing is humpback whales activity for the year 2021. You can see the date is on the axis here, and on the y-axis is the hour of day. So these curved lines are the sunset and the sunrise. And each of these little bubbles is a humpback whale that is vocally active. So I can hover over this bubble and it tells me that on September 3rd, from a specific time to a specific time, we detected 10 calls for 10 minutes. And that type of plot is possible to live on a website or to be shared with cell phones. And it's possible to update that plot in real time. So when whales are active, we can feed this plot with the data that the computer produces, and a user such as a First Nation community or even vessels can get access to that knowledge. And the second plot that we obviously like to do is maps. So this is again a coast of British Columbia, and the place where we localize at the moment is up here in Gitga'at territory, where Nicole spoke to you from. And there we have 4 hydrophones that are capable of localizing whales. Each of these little points here is a hydrophone location. And this is the area where these hydrophones can localize whales. And now we can start plotting the locations of different call types. So I have these weird acronyms, but these points are fin whale feeding calls that we localized in 2021. And those are killer whales or orca that were vocal. And then of course the bubble net feeding locations that you've already seen are also there. And each of these points contain information about the day, the date, and the position where these whales were vocally active. And again, this is hopefully be able to be updated in real time and becomes knowledge to managers and communities. All right, I'll go back to my presentation for the last part. Because before I close it up, what I really also want to stress is we are interested in understanding whales, but we're also interested in understanding threats to whales and how healthy their environment is. And one of the biggest threats are vessels and shipping. And it's generally understood that there's about 3 layers of threat that originate from vessels. The first one is a whale being struck by a vessel, and this is what Grace touched about. And then the second layer is something that is called listening space reduction. And what this means is, given the fact that it is so important for whales to have sound as a tool to live, what happens when a vessel comes by, and that was an actual recording of a vessel approaching a hydrophone, is it blindfolds these whales. They're using sound for everything. And if a lot of noise is put into the ocean in proximity, it's the equivalent of us having a thick fog rolling into our area. It takes away our eyesight, it takes away our ability to act as we are normally used to. And that happens for these whales as well. And technically this is called masking, or as I said, listening space reduction, and it is a problem. The third layer is something that is more diffuse and less well understood. And it's the stress that the noise and the presence of a vessel causes to a whale. It is less well understood because there may not be a direct visible or audible impact to the whales, but it's documented in literature that this causes stress to whales. So it's something to be aware of and put a little bit of research focus onto. And this is why we not only monitoring whales and what they do, but we're also monitoring how noisy the oceans are where we monitor these whales. And just as an example, these are two plots that show the noise in the ocean. The upper plot here is something I would call maybe a noise stock chart. So again, you see a timeline for a full year, and on the y-axis is simply the noise level. How noisy was it during the year? And this was recorded at Orca Lab, a very interesting site because it has so much orca activity, but also a lot of vessel traffic. And what you can see, or what we think we see, is we see a natural trend in noise that is noisy in the winter, caused by weather, and then it dips down and then it goes back up towards the new year. And this bump here is what I believe caused by vessel noise. So this is the summertime when there's a lot of fishing and recreational activity. So this is, if you want, fog introduced by us humans into whale habitat, which makes it harder for them to carry out their life function. And then on the bottom is a tool that we hope is useful for managers in particular, that we call a noise calendar. So each box here is for a calendar day in a year, and the color coding is how noisy that day was. Green means it's a quiet day or a non-foggy day for the whales, and everything that is red means the whales probably didn't have a very good time underwater in that particular day. And that can be used to assess the overall ocean health and assess how whales may or may not be able to compensate for these conditions they are living in. And I think this may be my last slide. I give it back to Janie.
Thanks, Ben. I can't wait to share some of that stuff on that website. But I wanted to comment on your one slide where you had the boat noise coming in while you were speaking. That was very effective. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but it really got the point across, right?
Yes.
It was good. I'm just going to share my screen and I just have 2 slides I want to share with everybody. And then we can start answering. There are some questions coming in, so then we can start answering some questions in real time. I realize that it's probably getting late, but maybe we can at least get a couple of questions in there. So I'll just quickly share my screen. So I'm just going to do a very quick overview. I think that I think the information that's been shared here tonight is exceptional, and there's definitely a running theme, and that is that it is very possible to do research on whales and not have an impact on their daily lives. And I think we've really proven that here today, and it makes me feel really proud actually to say those words. Everything from drones to listening and understanding whale habitat use, which of course is extremely important, what areas and why those areas are important to whales at certain locations up and down this coast. And I think that combining all of the efforts that we've been listening to today, I think we're actually going to be able to put those little pieces together, as Aideen said, put little pieces of that puzzle together and really understand how important this coast is to whales, but what areas really do need protection. And I think the data that we're collecting will play a large role in being shared with coastal First Nations and government to really, put it down and say these areas need to be protected for whales and other species that are also in that particular ecosystem. And I just want to thank all of you. I think there's really nothing left for me to say because you all said it all so very well. It really means a lot, to me. I'm just going to go to the next slide here. I think everyone has spoke a little bit to it. And of course, Ben did, talking about the hydrophones. And it's very interesting for each person when they first either see a whale or listen to a whale. And Nicole spoke to her experience of listening to a whale. And for me, it was when I was very young, listening to a whale truly changed my life. And so it really is about listening, and not just maybe listening to whales, but listening to each other as well, right? So what I'd like to do is just play a minute of a humpback whale song before we go into answering some of the questions. But just, this is one of the most magical things I've ever listened to, and this is what's filling our oceans worldwide. So I'll just play this. I hope you can hear it. So when I hear that personally, I know that I'm listening to an intelligent and emotional creature. And I think that's something we always have to remember, that these whales are very bonded to each other, but they're also very bonded to their environment. And we can play a huge role in protecting that environment for them for centuries ahead of us, I would like to say. I also think, though, I just really want to mention the people that help us out and that really support us long term for many, many years now, so that we can bring these type of research projects to you tonight. And there's a lot of people that I won't mention, because there's so many single people that have helped us out, which is just incredible. But I do want to mention some of the people or organizations that have for a long time supported us, some for almost 20 years. And, you know, Fisheries, Oceans in Canada have really supported us. Save Our Seas Foundation, which I'm scared is being hidden by this little thing up here. And of course, the Gitga'at First Nation. I mean, they started everything for us when they gave us permission to come into their territory. That really started the dream. And the Donner Canadian Foundation, which again, has been with us for a really long time. I just want to move that. I realize it's in the way. And Andy, if you're here tonight, the Willow Grove Foundation from the very start, thank you so much. And then recently, the Heiltsuk First Nation and the Kitasoo Hi have also become partners in this coastwide hydrophone network. And on this last slide, having the same thing you had go on there, Nicole, it won't go. Orca Lab, the Pacific Orca Society, they've been a huge partner, and that's where I started, was actually at Orca Lab. So they just mean the absolute world to me. So I really want to emphasize, you know, we can do research and not have an impact on whales, but partnerships and collaborations is really the way to go. And I think we all really realize that. We will go into answering some questions that are here. And I'll leave this up for just a second. I just want to make sure that you know that there is a website you can go to, which is bcwhales.org. If there's any questions that aren't answered tonight, we will also post this presentation on that website. And of course, the Facebook is BC Whales, Instagram is BC Whales. But I also wanted to bring your attention to listening to Whales Live. You can go to Orca Lab's orcalive.net. And almost 24/7 all year round, you can listen to Orca. And in the fall, you can listen to these humpback whales singing live, which is truly remarkable. And then very soon, we're going to have our BC-wide Hydrophone Network interactive website. And that website will speak to some of what Ben was showing you, looking at where the whale hotspots are, where vessel noise is an issue, but also looking at where we're finding these hotspots of large days or months or weeks of whales vocalizing in certain areas. And we're really keen to share all of that with you. I'm going to stop sharing right now so that we can get back to the team here. And I know it's getting late. We're getting close to 9 o'clock. Poor Aideen. I keep thinking about you. Well, I think this is a good time. I think that you guys just really covered absolutely everything. And I want to thank everybody that joined us tonight. It was a huge, huge attendance, and it just means the world to us that you were here listening to us. But I really want to thank you, Nicole and Grace and Ben and Aideen. Thank you so much. You're just doing incredible work for the North Coast Cetacean Society and BC Whales. And yeah, look forward to working with you in the field this year. Yay.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really great.
Thanks, Paul.
I
Thank
want to say
you,
thank
Jane, as
you.
well.
Oh, sorry.
Go,
I just
Nicole.
wanted
Go
to
for it.
say thank you guys, because I even like every day I'm learning something new, and you guys just taught me a lot again. It was great. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, and thanks to you, Janie, as well.
Yeah.
Huge thank you for organizing and for making it all happen.
Yeah. Great.
That's
All right.
right.
Well, everybody have a wonderful night. Take care, and we'll talk to you very soon.
You take care too, please.
Okay. Good night.
Thanks, folks.
Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Have a nice coffee there, Aideen.
I will do. A strong one.
Yeah.
Good to see you all, and thanks
All
everyone for
right.
attending.
Good night, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.